Okay guys, so I am finally able to get out here with the Curado DC and do some casting to get an impression on how well this thing can cast, to see if it lives up to the hype. Now I apologize it took so long. I had some family come into town that I don't get to see very often, so literally I had a whole week where I was spending time with them, and family comes before YouTube channel. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start out with the dial set to 4, which according to Shimano is the strongest brake setting for very high winds, skipping, and beginners. And we're going to test the casting range. We're going to go down to 1/4 of an ounce all the way up to a little bit over a 1/2 ounce and see how this thing does. Now Shimano recommends that with the Curado DC or any DC reel, you set the cast control or spool tension to where the where the spool movement is minimized. So you tighten this dial until that side-to-side wobble goes away. And this is supposed to give you the best performance for the DC brakes. Okay, there we go. Got it all set. So we're going to start out with just a little 1/4 ounce square bill. See how this thing handles the lighter end of lures. Okay guys, so as usual I have 10-pound mono, 6'8", medium heavy, fast. And all right, let's see what happens. Okay, that didn't go very far at all. Probably about 20 yards. And one thing I noticed was it does have that DC whine, but it's not very loud. Let me see if I can let you guys listen to this. Oh, okay. My thumb was too slow to stop that backlash. So that's something that's very interesting to me, that the DC noise does not seem to be very loud compared to the other DC reels, at least from what I could remember. Okay, so in the middle of the cast, the spool was really controlled, but you definitely have to stop the spool with your thumb when the lure hits the ground. And to me, that's to be expected when you have the spool tension set like this, and that's with pretty much any reel except for maybe 1 or 2. Okay, so distance was doable. 1/4 ounce. Hopefully you guys can see where this thing's landing. Okay, so we can see that it can handle a 1/4 ounce, no problem. With the lighter rod, we'll probably get more distance. But as you can see, the rod is barely even bending with this lure weight. So let's go to number 3, which I believe is supposed to be the Fluorocarbon mode. And let's see what happens. Okay, wow, there was an overrun in the middle of the cast there. Caught me by surprise, but the distance was a lot better. It probably went about 30 yards. Okay, let's see if this thing will adapt to that overrun. Now the retrieve is just as smooth as the Curado K, just as powerful. as to be expected because it's got the same brass micro gears. Okay, yeah, so it overran in the middle of the cast. So that makes me think that this lure is probably too light for this brake setting. Okay, so against my better judgment, we're gonna go down to 2 on the brake setting, which is the braid slash monofilament mode. And let's see what happens. Okay, so I did a sidearm cast. It went pretty far. Spool was really controlled. So that's strange. This is supposed to be a weaker brake setting, but it was more controlled, probably because I did a sidearm cast. So let's do an experiment here. I'm gonna stick it back in 3 and do a sidearm cast once I get all this shit off the crankbait. All right, so we're gonna go back to 3. Let's do a sidearm cast to see if that spool overruns. Okay, yeah, there was an overrun there, which is strange. The distance was, I can't really say that between 3 and 2, one is getting farther than the other. They look to be about the same to me. So I'm gonna stick it back into 2 and see if I can do an overhead cast, see how the spool behaves. So far the distance is pretty good, but nothing to really write home about. I think the Curado K was doing something very similar. All right, overhead cast on line setting 2. Okay, that's pretty strange. Apparently the brake setting that's lower, it's got more spool control. Okay, we'll do one more cast. Okay, so that's pretty good considering how heavy this spool is. I keep catching salad. Considering how heavy this spool is, throwing this little 1/4 ounce square bill that far, which is probably about 30 yards, is pretty impressive, I would say. Okay guys, so let's go to brake setting 1, which is the least amount of brakes. See what happens. I don't know. I don't think this is going to be very good, but let's see what happens. I'm just going to do a nice sidearm cast. Yeah, this happened right here. Now luckily it doesn't look too bad. So I should be able to pick this out. Okay, there we go. Okay, so on setting 1, I think this lure is definitely too light and definitely not aerodynamic enough to be able to cast without a bird's nest. We're gonna try one more time. We're gonna do an overhead cast now with some oomph. See if we can get out there a little farther. Okay, so with that overhead cast, the overrun had some time to sort itself out before the lure hit the water. Okay guys, so I took this opportunity to tie on a JACKALL mudsucker, which, if I remember correctly, weighs a little bit more than a ½ ounce. It's a topwater bait with the weight at the back, so this thing should cast really good. And we're gonna start off in line mode, actually dial mode number 1. Let's see what this thing can do with this top water. Okay, wow, that went, that looks to be about 50 yards, just by my estimation. Maybe a little bit less, but pretty close to 50 yards. So that's pretty impressive. But then again, any reel should cast this type of lure with no problem. As you can see with the spool, it looked like it had hints of an overrun, but because the cast was so long, the brakes were able to sort that overrun out towards the end there. And let's try one more cast. Damn, that thing must have went 50 yards again. Now the spool, once again, was overrunning. I think this lure is probably not quite heavy enough to get the potential out of the #1 setting on the dial, but it's close. So something a little bit heavier, maybe a heavier top water, something closer to 3/4 of an ounce will probably sort that out. Okay guys, so we'll do a few more casts in all the different settings, but the one thing that you may be disappointed in, or you may not be disappointed in because you may not like it, is that definitely the DC whine or the DC song is definitely muted compared to the other DC reels. I can tell. So I'm gonna do a long bomb cast, and I'm gonna put the DC right up to the mic, and hopefully you guys can hear it. Now there's a wind coming in, so I might backlash, but yeah, it's definitely muted compared to the Scorpion and the METANIUM, at least from what I remember. Now when I get them side by side on the casting field, we'll definitely know. But some of you guys may find that disappointing. Some of you guys may be like, cool, I didn't really care or like that noise anyway. Okay, so definitely you saw some overrun with this weight lure on this setting. So let's go to 2, see if that solves the overrun, and see what it does to the distance. Okay, distance probably looks to be about 5 yards short. Overrun is still there, surprisingly. Not as bad as online sitting 1. It sorted itself out at the very end. Let's try again. Let's do a sidearm cast. Okay. So distance definitely went down. There's no doubt about it. Spool a little bit more controlled. So that tells me the #2 brake setting still is pretty low. Okay, let's go to #3 with this top water. Okay, that's definitely short. It's definitely short of setting #2. I saw some fluffing there. Usually with my DC reels that I have, there's rarely any fluffing. And this Curado DC seems to like to fluff. All right, let's try again. Okay, that was definitely longer. That was definitely a long cast for this setting here. Okay, so let's go to #4, see if this tames the fluffing and see what kind of distance we get with this lure. All right, that's definitely way short. 0 fluffing, 0 overrun. Okay, so let's try an overhead. Okay, so once again, you definitely have to stop this spool with your thumb for DC reels if you have the spool tension set this way. But I'm going to show you guys something. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to set this spool control or the spool tension to how a lot of Shimano guys or a lot of guys do, is that I'm going to tighten it up and I'm going to loosen it to where the lure hits the ground is just going to have a couple of loops. Right there. So if I did it with the spool tension set previously, you would have had a pretty big backlash when that lure hit the water. So now, more than likely, I predict we'll be able to go thumb free, and thumb free meaning you don't have to stop the spool with your thumb at the end of the cast. So let's see if that's true. Yep, distance looked to be relatively the same, maybe a little bit short. Let's try an overhead. Okay, so there you go, thumb free all the way through the cast, even on splashdown. Okay, so let's go to setting 3 and see if that's the case. Wow, I had a pretty big overrun there that tangled the line. Okay guys, let's try this again with the overhead cast. Yep, pretty much thumb free throughout the cast. There was a little bit of wind coming in. So let's go to number 2 on the dial, see what happens. Okay, so distance was pretty good. I wasn't really trying to bomb it out there. I was just doing an easy sidearm cast. So let's do a long overhead cast and see what happens. Okay, so distance was definitely shorter, but spool was very controlled. Did not have to stop it with my thumb. So if you like to fish like that, if you know, kind of your thumb is not trained, quote unquote, then tightening up the spool tension will definitely help you out and you'll still get pretty good distance. So let's go to number 1 and see what happens here. Okay, distance definitely went down. Spool control was really good, but I could tell I lost about 10 yards. Okay, so definitely if you want to go thumb free, tightening this up is the way to go. And I probably have it too tight, meaning that you don't have to tighten it all the way up like I did. You can loosen it up and do in between, make adjustments. Since this Curado DC only has 4 adjustments, then I suggest you use the spool control, spool tension cap to make your adjustments as needed within each numbered mode. Okay, we'll do a sidearm cast. Okay, not bad. Probably went about 40 yards. Okay, so you will definitely lose a few feet by tightening up the spool tension for this particular lure. Now in the past, with all the distance measuring I've done on the field, in some cases tightening up the spool tension will get you longer distance than loose spool tension. Just depends on the lure, how it goes through the air, etc., etc. So now I am going to whip out the Curado K, and we're going to see if we can see any kind of difference in casting. There's a Curado K spooled with the same line, and we're going to start off with the same 1/4 ounce square bill. This is the same rod, 6'8" medium heavy. Now, I remember being pretty impressed with this Curado K throwing a 1/4 ounce square bill a little over a year ago when I first took it out on the water to cast it. Now, I was using a lighter power rod, much better casting rod at the time, but got to make do with what I got. I'm going to start off with all 4 brakes on inside, and I'm going to turn the external dial to 1. I'm going to set the spool tension to just minimize the side-to-side movement. Okay, there we go. So let's see what happens with the Curado K. I can't remember the last time I casted this reel, to be honest. I think it's a few months ago when I was doing the comparison with the Bantam. So that was a few months back. Okay guys, hopefully you can remember where the Curado DC was landing with this lure. Whoa, that was pretty far for what is almost maximum braking. Okay, that's probably going about 30 yards. Not bad considering this rod is not really loading up with this lure. Okay, I would say that the K is probably beating the DC for this lure. Let me know what you guys think. I'm trying to remember where the DC was hitting. Okay guys, we're gonna go down to 3 internally. See if that gives us some more distance. Nope, what it gave us was a huge blow up. I should have put the external dial all the way to maximum, but like a dummy, I didn't think about it. So let me try to pick this out. Okay guys, I am turning the dial all the way up to 6. Okay, spool was super controlled, so I'm gonna go and back down on that dial. Let's go to 5. Okay, so I would say it's at least equaling that Curado DC in distance for this lure. From what I remember, at least. Once again, this is a much lighter spool, at least without line. I've yet to weigh the spools with all the line, which I'll do when I get back. So I'm going to back this down to 4, I think, externally. Spool still really controlled. Distance didn't look to be any different. Wind has started to kick up, as you guys can see. It's no longer glassy like it was earlier. Okay, so let's go down to 3 externally. Okay, so got a little bit more distance, and the spool definitely was starting to get unruly there. As you can see, I had to feather it just a little bit. Okay, so I think we found the limit of the Curado K for this 1/4 ounce lure. Let's tie on that top water. Okay guys, I'm gonna leave the settings as they are, 3 on inside, 3 on outside, and slowly back down from there. Okay, so it went a pretty good distance, probably close to 40 yards. Spool's very controlled, so definitely there's more in it. So let's start backing it down. Going down to 2. Wow, okay. Now we're getting somewhere. Okay, let's back it down to 1 on the external dial. And that happened. Okay guys, we're gonna go to 1.5. That should be the perfect setting for this lure here. Okay, so wow, okay. All right, folks. So in my eyes, I think the Curado K is definitely equaling the DC in casting for both these lures. As I said before, once it's set up, once it's adjusted correctly, this Curado K is a monster when it comes to casting. Whoa, yeah, that went close to 50 yards. Spool super controlled. Spool definitely does seem faster on the K than the DC. So I'm going to cast the DC a couple more times before I go home and give you guys my final thoughts. Okay guys, I got the DC once again. What I'm going to do is I'm going to loosen this spool tension to how Shimano wants us to do it. Right there. And I'm going to tighten it just a little bit. Probably an 1/8 of a turn. And I'm going to put it on 1 and we'll see what happens. Okay, that went a long way, probably close to 50 yards. Okay, so I'm going to tighten it up just a little bit more. Let's see what happens. Wow, I don't know what happened. it just blew up for no reason. I wonder if it's this line. Okay guys, I tightened the spool tension up just a hair more, just a little bit more. See if we can tame that overrun. Wow, that thing went far. I'm starting to notice something here, guys. Sidearm Cast seems to have better spool control than overhead. Could be that the lure has a lower trajectory, of course, and it's not catching a wind, you know, 20-30 feet up that I can't feel. Could be that the overhead cast does allow for higher spool RPMs, but the wind is coming in this way, as you can see on the water. Let's see what happens with the overhead cast. Wow, that went a long way. I would say it's easily equaling that Curado K. Spool was fluffing up there. Sorted itself out at the end because it was a long cast. So I'm not sure right now which is the longer caster between the two. Because that DC is throwing this out there, but the spool control is very un-DC like. Right, there's a lot of fluffing in the middle. Now I'm going to keep tightening this spool tension here to eliminate that fluff if I can. Okay, I tightened it up a little bit more. Let's see what happens. It seems to be okay on the first half of the cast, but then towards the end, that's when the second half of the cast, that's when the overrun comes in. Okay, we're going to try a sidearm cast, see if that matters. Okay, a little bit better, but as you can see, it was still fluffing. Still went out there a long way. So I'll have to say the DC has a slight edge when it comes to distance, at least with this lure. I think the K might have been throwing that 1/4 ounce square bill a little bit farther. Tighten up the spool tension some more. Man, it's still going way out there. I keep tightening that spool tension and it's still going at least 45 to 50 yards. So guys, if you want thumb-free fishing, definitely tighten up this spool tension knob. You won't lose that much distance apparently. And it'll cause you less headaches if you're slow on the thumb. Okay guys, so I am gonna get back home and give you my thoughts about what happened today on the table. Whew, so see you there. Okay guys, so I'm back home and I wrote down quite a few things to say about the Curado DC. Now, the first thing I should say is that Shimano did something very unusual this time around in the fact that they kind of hyped up this reel before ICAST and released several teaser videos. They've given the reel to several of the, I guess they're sponsored YouTubers, and you know, you saw a bunch of videos of really long casts and people casting into walls without backlashing. And it kind of got a lot of people hyped up about this Curado DC. Now, me personally, I kind of had my suspicions about the Curado DC. I shouldn't say suspicions, but I kind of knew what to expect, I guess, from the standpoint of how much this thing was going to cost, what kind of braking system they were going to use, and then once I found out the spool was 20, almost 21 grams, then that kind of let me know pretty much where this reel was going to fall in line as far as performance. And so let's talk about what happened on the water. Now, the first thing that you need to know is that you probably heard this thing is very quiet for a DC reel. Now, it does have the DC whine, you can hear it, but compared to the other DC reels in recent memory, the Scorpion, the METANIUM, it's very muted compared to those. So that might be a good thing, it might be a bad thing, but I do know a lot of people, when they get a DC reel, they kind of want that song that it sings whenever you cast it. Now, it does sing the song, it just doesn't sing it very loudly. And as far as the DC brake system, it seems that 2 and 3 are mixed up as far as braking force, at least in my opinion. Meaning that 2 seems to have more braking force or spool control versus 3. And yeah, that's kind of weird. I don't know if that's a mess up or if it's supposed to be like that, but I can definitely tell you that the number 2 is supposed to have, I guess, less braking. Actually has a little bit more braking than setting number 3. So that was kind of weird. Now, also, the spool control on this thing is, for a DC reel, it's pretty bad. I'm just gonna say it, it's pretty bad. If you see the on the water casting videos for the METANIUM and the Scorpion DC, you'll rarely ever see a fluff up or an overrun unless I purposely set the brakes too low just to see what would happen. Now on this thing, there was overruns and fluff ups and whatnot all over the place, as you saw. So as far as that goes, if you want better spool control, you're gonna have to tighten up this spool tension knob, especially if you want to go thumb free. As you saw, even with the lure splashing down, you have to tighten up that spool tension knob tighter than what Shimano says in the manual or in the little instructions that they give. So that guy who cast it into the brick wall and there was no backlash, I can pretty much bet that he tightened this thing all the way down. And pretty much any reel can do that if you tighten up the spool tension enough. Okay, so let's talk about distance versus the Curado K. Its first and main rival, in my opinion. Now, I would say that with the 1/4 ounce square bill, you are looking at roughly equal, but I'm going to say the slight edge goes to the K, at least visually in my opinion, that the square bills seem to go a little bit farther with the K. Now if you saw different, let me know in the comments. Now as far as that top water lure, okay, that top water lure is a little bit over 1/2 ounce, probably close to 5/8 of an ounce. And I'm going to give the slight advantage to the DC because it seemed to consistently hit longer casts a little bit, maybe a little bit longer by a few feet than the K, but it was more consistent hitting those distances. So as far as the top water lure, you're looking at, in my opinion, the Curado DC over the K. Now if you saw something different, then let me know in the comments. Alright, so as far as overall casting, honestly, I can't really separate the two. The limited number of adjustments on the brakes makes it harder to dial in, definitely, than even the Curado K with its, SPS Infinity. But once again, casting a little bit better or around the same as a Curado K is nothing to be ashamed of, because as I said before, once you got this thing dialed in, this thing is a monster. Okay, so now that was just on the water impressions. So what I'm going to do next, of course, is I'm going to go out on the casting field and do some measured long bombing with the casting plug to see if the Curado DC can truly beat its older brother. Now, I've had a lot of questions about the Curado DC versus other reels. Now, let's talk about one thing, and that is the price. Now, a lot of people, the most common reel they want me to compare it to is going to be this Scorpion DC, which is, in my opinion, the better reel. Better caster, better spool control, probably a longer caster. It's hard to tell without having them head to head, but it's got a much better brake system, the IDC5, which has got, what, 15 different adjustments. Well, this, of course, is stuck with only 4. So when you are looking at these two reels, this is $250. Well, this you can get for, I think, about $260, $270, so a little bit more. Personally, I would spend a little bit more money on the Scorpion DC versus the Curado DC. Now, here's the rub. A lot of people thought that since this was allegedly the latest DC reel, that it would be better than, a bunch of other more expensive reels from Shimano, like the METANIUM, MGL, etc., etc. And that's just simply not the case. Now, IDC4 is not new. It's been around. It's been around for over 10 years in other Shimano DC reels in Japan. Now, don't get the small price differential. Don't let that fool you. Right now, with the current exchange rate, if Shimano was to bring the Scorpion DC over and sell it for the manufacturer suggested retail price, or MSRP, you'd be looking at $338. So Shimano USA would probably round that up to about $350. So these are not in the same class, nor were they meant to be. This is a beginner DC reel, and this is a I guess an intermediate reel. Shimano just happened to give this reel a very excellent brake system from a more expensive reel. So there we go. Shimano Curado DC. I was really only disappointed in the spool control, not really the cast distance, because I kind of knew what to expect. And I'm kind of a hard person to impress when it comes to casting distance in reels, because I have reels like this, and then reels like this, and of course I have CALAIS DC, ANTARES DC, EXSENCE DC, etc., etc. So it's really hard to really blow my socks off when it comes to casting distance with these new reels. Now, the casting was very excellent. Just the spool control was subpar in my book when it comes to DC reels. Okay, guys, so just be on the lookout for that on-field battle coming out soon, and then of course it's going to go head-to-head with all the other DC reels, including the Scorpion, in the standardized testing. Okay, guys, thanks a lot.